Cheshire is shaped by history and quiet endurance. Across its halls, churches, and old streets, stories linger in silence. Tonight, we explore 10 places where the past may not have fully let go. Gorsworth Hall. On certain autumn evenings, when the light fades early and the village lanes grow quiet, Gorsworth Hall seems to hold its breath. The great timbered house stands calmly enough by day, its gardens orderly, its walls heavy with centuries of history. Yet, as dusk settles, there are moments when the air itself appears unsettled, as though something unseen is stirring within. The hall has stood here since the late medieval period, shaped and reshaped by generations of the Fitton family. It was a place of privileged influence and careful appearances. Behind its carved panels and long galleries, lives were lived under the strict codes of their age, where reputation mattered deeply and secrets were rarely forgiven. It is perhaps no surprise that the past here has acquired a voice of its own. One of the most enduring stories associated with Gorsworth Hall centers on an unexplained scent. On several occasions, witnesses have reported the sudden smell of incense drifting through the building, rich and unmistakable, yet with no visible source. The first notable report is said to have followed the discovery of a human skeleton concealed within a cupboard, an unsettling find that raised more questions than answers. Since then, the fragrance has returned sporadically, lingering briefly before fading, as though marking a presence rather than an event. Alongside this phenomenon is the figure known locally as the Dark Lady. She is described as a woman dressed in dark clothing, seen walking from the hall through the village towards the nearby inn on quiet autumn evenings. Some believe she resembles Mary Fitton, a former resident, whose life was marked by scandal, ambition, and eventual retreat from courtly favor. Whether this connection is history or hopeful storytelling remains uncertain. A former caretaker, speaking anonymously in the late 20th century, recalled locking up the hall one evening when the smell of incense appeared without warning. He described a sudden chill and an overwhelming reluctance to turn around, despite the certainty that he was no longer alone. Today, visitors may walk freely through Gorsworth Hall, admiring its architecture and gardens. Yet when the light begins to fade and the air grows still, some leave with the uneasy feeling that the Dark Lady's walk may not yet be over, and that the past here has not entirely learned to rest. Chester Town Hall. At the heart of Chester, where civic pride and ceremony converge, the town hall rises in confident Gothic splendor. By day, it is a place of order, administration, and public life. Voices echo with purpose, footsteps follow familiar routes, and the building seems entirely obedient to its modern role. Yet beneath this carefully maintained surface, there is a quieter story, one that rarely finds its way into official records. The town hall was constructed during the Victorian era, a time deeply fascinated by medieval grandeur and civic authority. Its towers, arches, and grand staircase were designed to impress, to remind visitors of continuity and control. But like many such buildings, it was built not only upward, but downward as well. Beneath the polished stone and decorative woodwork lie storage spaces and service rooms, areas intended to be unseen and unremarked upon. One such place, a storeroom beneath the main staircase, has become the focus of persistent unease. Details are vague, and perhaps deliberately so. There is no single dramatic tale attached to the space, no named apparition, no clear moment of tragedy. Instead, there is a shared impression among those who have reason to enter it, a sense that something is wrong, that the air feels heavier, that the silence presses too closely. Several staff members over the years have spoken privately of an instinctive reluctance to remain there longer than necessary. One former employee, recalling an incident from the late 1980s, described descending the stairs to retrieve stored items when an intense feeling of being watched overcame him. He noted that the space was empty, yet the sensation did not fade until he returned to the light above. What makes the story unsettling is not what is seen, but what is not. There are no footsteps, no shadows cast against the walls, no sudden movements to confirm fear or dismiss it. Only the persistent awareness of another presence just beyond perception, as though something waits patiently in a place long forgotten. Today, Chester Town Hall continues to serve the city faithfully. Visitors admire its architecture and climb its staircase without a second thought. Few pause to consider what lies beneath their feet. Yet for those who know the storeroom below the building carries a subtle reminder that even places of authority can harbor quiet, unspoken unease, lingering in the spaces we choose not to see. St. James Church, set a short distance from Gorsworth Hall, St. James Church rests quietly among ancient trees and worn gravestones. In daylight, it appears peaceful, even comforting, its stone walls, softened by age and lichen. Yet when the church is empty and the doors close behind the last visitor, the atmosphere is said to change in subtle but unsettling ways. The church has served the village for centuries, standing as a place of worship, mourning, and remembrance. Generations of the Fitton family are buried here, their tombs lining the interior in silent testimony to power loss and legacy. It is around these tombs that the most persistent stories gather, as though memory itself refuses to remain still. Witnesses have spoken of a woman in a green dress seen standing near the Fitton monuments. She is not described as threatening. Instead, she appears sorrowful, her presence accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature and a faint sound resembling a sigh. Those who hear it often describe an instinctive stillness, an awareness that movement might disturb something fragile and deeply rooted. Some believe this figure may be the same dark lady associated with Gorsworth Hall, her wandering path carrying her not only through village lanes but into the church itself. Others suggest she is someone else, entirely bound, not to the hall, but to the graves she seems unable to leave behind. As with many such tales, certainty remains elusive. Adding to the unease are reports of other manifestations. A hooded female figure has been glimpsed both within the church grounds and near the rectory. Voices have been heard where no one stands. On rarer occasions, a man with dark eyes and a pointed beard has been reported watching silently from the edge of vision before vanishing without sound. A local volunteer, speaking of an evening in the late 20th century, recalled locking the church when a sudden chill passed through the nave. She described the sound of a single breath close behind her and a strong reluctance to turn around, choosing instead to leave without looking back. Today, St. James Church remains open to visitors, a place of quiet reflection. Yet as shadows lengthen across the tombs and the air grows cold, some sense that not all who linger here are ready to depart, and that certain sorrows once carried too long may still be searching for release. Chester Water Tower, standing near the river, away from the busier streets of the city, Chester Water Tower rises with quiet authority. Its circular stone walls and narrow windows give it the appearance of a watchful presence, as though it has never quite stopped observing its surroundings. Even in daylight, there is something austere about the tower, something that resists warmth or familiarity. The structure is believed to occupy ground once associated with the Roman fortress of Dewa Victrix when Chester served as a strategic military stronghold. Soldiers would have patrolled these edges of the settlement, guarding against intrusion and enforcing discipline. Duty here was not optional. A moment's neglect could mean severe punishment or worse. Local tradition speaks of a Roman sentry assigned to this area, a young soldier said to have abandoned his post to visit a woman he loved. Whether the story reflects a real individual or a moral tale shaped by time is uncertain. What remains is the belief that his failure was never forgiven, and that his punishment did not end with death. Reports describe a solitary figure, dressed in what appears to be ancient military attire, standing motionless near the tower or pacing its perimeter. He is most often seen in poor weather, when rain blurs the edges of the world, and the river moves slowly below. Some witnesses claim he vanishes abruptly when approached, leaving behind only an oppressive silence. A former night watchman, recalling an incident from the late 20th century, described seeing a tall shape outlined briefly against the tower wall during a routine patrol. He noted an overwhelming sense of guilt and tension in the air, as though he had interrupted something long rehearsed. Moments later, the figure was gone, yet the feeling remained. What gives the story its weight is the sense of repetition. The sentry is not said to wander freely or seek attention. He stands, watches, and waits. His presence suggests an unfinished task, a duty endlessly resumed but never completed. Today, Chester Water Tower is a familiar landmark passed by walkers and visitors without much thought. Yet when evening falls and the river darkens, some pause and glance back. In the quiet between footsteps, it is easy to imagine that someone else is still on watch, bound by an oath made long ago and unwilling or unable to step away. The Bear and Billet Inn. Tucked along one of Chester's older streets, the Bear and Billet Inn presents a welcoming face to the casual visitor. Its timbered exterior and low ceilings speak of comfort, warmth, and long evenings spent in conversation. By daylight, it feels like many historic inns across England, steeped in age but entirely benign. Yet as night settles, the building is said to reveal a far less hospitable character. The inn dates back several centuries, a period when such establishments were not only places of rest, but sites of rigid hierarchy. Servants lived close to their labor, often unseen and rarely remembered. It is within this social imbalance that one of the inn's most unsettling legends is said to have taken root. Among the reported apparitions is that of a small, elderly woman, most often glimpsed on the staircase. Curiously, she is said to appear only to male witnesses, vanishing before she can be addressed. Her presence is fleeting, leaving behind confusion rather than fear, as though she belongs to a different rhythm of time entirely. More disturbing, however, is the story of a young servant girl. According to local tradition, she was locked inside a cupboard by her employer and then forgotten when he was called away on business. Deprived of food and help, she is said to have died there unnoticed until long after. Whether this account reflects an actual event or a tale shaped by collective unease is impossible to confirm. What remains are the experiences associated with it. Staff and guests have reported unexplained sounds near enclosed spaces, including faint knocking and movement where none should exist. Others describe sudden drops in temperature, particularly on the stairs and near storage areas. The cold is often described as personal, as though it presses close rather than filling the room. A former barman, recalling a late shift in the 1990s, spoke of closing up when a chill passed through him without warning. He described an intense sense of being observed, accompanied by the faint impression of breathing close by. He left the area immediately, unwilling to investigate further. Today, the Bear and Billet continues to welcome visitors with food, drink, and warmth. Yet beneath the laughter and lamplight, some sense an older presence, lingering in the shadows, a quiet reminder of lives once confined, forgotten, and perhaps still waiting to be acknowledged. Dewa Roman experience. Beneath the modern streets of Chester, lies a carefully reconstructed vision of the city's Roman past. The Dewa Roman experience invites visitors to step backward through time-walking streets that once echoed with sandals and commands. It is an immersive space designed to educate and entertain. Yet for some, the descent into this underground world brings an unease that feels distinctly unplanned. Chester, once known as Diva Victrix, was a major Roman fortress, home to soldiers, administrators, and civilians alike. Discipline here was strict, and violence an accepted part of order. While the exhibits aim to present history in controlled fragments, the ground itself has absorbed centuries of human presence, conflict, and fear. Visitors and staff have reported an unusual phenomenon within certain areas of the attraction. Without warning, some describe the sensation of invisible hands closing briefly around their necks. The experience is sudden and intensely physical, often lasting only a few seconds, yet leaving behind a lingering shock. Medical explanations have been suggested, including panic or confined air. Still, the consistency of such reports has ensured the story endures. One visitor, recalling an experience from the early 2000s, described feeling a sharp pressure at the base of the throat while standing alone in a dimly lit section of the exhibit. She noted a momentary inability to breathe, followed by a strong urge to leave immediately. No marks were left behind, and no cause was ever identified. What unsettles many is the sense that the encounter feels purposeful rather than random. There is no accompanying sound, no visible movement, only the impression of contact where none should exist. Those affected often speak of a sudden awareness of vulnerability, as though something briefly crossed the boundary between past and present. The Dewa Roman experience continues to operate as a popular educational attraction, carefully maintained and closely monitored. Visitors are reminded that it is a place of learning, not legend. Yet as footsteps echo through its corridors and shadows stretch along the walls, some leave with the uneasy thought that history here is not content to remain on display, and that certain memories, once disturbed, may still reach out in ways no reconstruction can fully contain. Little Morton Hall, rising from the Cheshire countryside with its famously warped timber frame, Little Morton Hall appears almost unreal, as though it has slowly bent out of shape under the weight of its own history. The black and white facade leans at uneasy angles, giving the impression that the building itself is listening. By day, it is admired as an architectural curiosity. By dusk, its distorted lines suggest something far less comfortable. The hall was constructed in stages from the early Tudor period, home to the Morton family for generations. Wealth and ambition shaped its expansion, but so did isolation. The surrounding land is quiet, and at night, the house feels separated from the modern world, left alone with its memories. Wood creaks naturally here, yet not all sounds are so easily explained. Many of the reported experiences center on a room above the porch. Visitors have spoken of seeing a distorted face appear briefly in the shadows, its expression described as hostile or watchful. Others report a man dressed in Tudor clothing, standing motionless, observing the room before fading from view. Whether these figures are connected or merely different interpretations of the same unease is unclear. Near the small chapel, a child has reportedly been heard crying. The sound is described as soft but persistent, often stopping abruptly when approached. No source has ever been found. The effect is unsettling rather than dramatic, leaving listeners with the impression of an interruption rather than a performance. The long gallery, with its famously bowed floor, is associated with sightings of a woman in a long grey gown. She is said to move slowly along the corridor, her presence marked by a sudden stillness in the air. Those who claim to have seen her often remark on the sense that the building itself seems to lean inward, as though enclosing both visitor and apparition together. A former guide speaking anonymously in the late 20th century recalled locking up one evening when the sound of footsteps followed him along the gallery. He noted that the floorboards were silent beneath his own feet, yet the sensation of being accompanied did not fade until he stepped outside. Today, Little Morton Hall welcomes visitors as a treasured historic site. Yet as the light dims and the angles of the house deepen, some feel that its warped shape is more than structural. It is as though the past here has pressed too hard against its walls and left behind impressions that still refuse to straighten. The George and Dragon. Along a busy road in Chester stands the George and Dragon, a building that has watched the city change around it for centuries. From the outside, it appears solid and unremarkable, another historic public house serving travelers and locals alike. Inside, however, the sense of time becomes less orderly. Here, stories do not sit neatly in the past. They overlap, intrude, and refuse to remain quiet. The site is believed to stand close to an old Roman road, and local tradition suggests that Roman burial grounds once lay nearby. Chester's Roman history runs deep beneath its streets, and at the George and Dragon, that depth feels uncomfortably close to the surface. The cellar, in particular, has long been regarded as a place to be avoided. One of the most frequently reported phenomena is that of a Roman sentry. Some say he has only heard his footsteps pacing steadily back and forth below ground. Others claim to have seen him walking from one end of the cellar to the other, solid and unmistakable. At times the sound is said to multiply, becoming the rhythmic tread of many men as though a column were passing through unseen. The cellar is also associated with darker figures. A monk believed to have been tortured and murdered on the site is said to linger there, accompanied by sounds of crying, screaming, and whistling. On rarer occasions, witnesses have described a small goblin-like figure glimpsed briefly before vanishing into shadow. Above-ground disturbances continue. Guests have reported phantom footsteps on the upper floors, and several accounts describe waking to find Roman soldiers standing silently at the foot of their beds. In the main areas of the pub, objects have been known to move without explanation. Lampshades swaying, items shifting when no one is near. A former manager speaking some years ago recalled being woken by someone whispering in his ear while he slept. He also described doors opening and closing on their own, and a persistent sense of being watched even in familiar rooms. Today, the George and Dragon remains a functioning public house, lively and welcoming. Yet beneath the noise and warmth, the building seems crowded with other rhythms, older footsteps, older regrets. For some, the most unsettling thought is not that so many stories exist here, but that none of them appear finished. Church of St. John the Baptist. At the western edge of Chester, close to the river, and slightly removed from the city's busiest paths, stand the quiet ruins of the Church of St. John the Baptist. Once a place of prominence and ambition, it now feels incomplete, as though history itself paused here and never quite resumed. Even in daylight, the site carries an air of separation from the present. The church dates back to the Norman period and was intended to rival the city's cathedral. That ambition, however, was never fully realized. In the late 19th century, the central tower collapsed without warning, leaving part of the structure broken and exposed. Since then, the western end of the church has existed as a ruin, open to the elements and to imagination. It is among these fallen stones that the most persistent stories are told. Witnesses have described encountering a tall monk near the remains of the old tower and along the nearby cobbled lane leading towards the river. He is said to move deliberately, his presence commanding attention rather than fear. On at least one occasion, pedestrians reported that the figure appeared to follow them, speaking in a language they could not understand. According to local accounts, the monk's words were calm but insistent. When those who heard him replied that they could not comprehend what he was saying, the figure is said to have stopped, regarded them briefly, and then vanished. No explanation was ever offered, and no trace remained. Other sightings have added to the atmosphere. A nun wearing a bluish habit has been reported within the ruined sections of the church, often seen standing silently among the broken arches. She is described as distant rather than threatening, her appearance brief and easily missed by anyone not paying close attention. A passerby, recalling an evening encounter in the late 20th century, described feeling an unexpected pressure to leave the area quickly, despite no obvious cause. He noted that the site felt suddenly crowded, as though unseen observers had gathered quietly behind him. Today, the Church of St. John the Baptist remains a place of reflection and historical interest. Visitors walk its paths, read its plaques, and admire its age-worn stonework. Yet as shadows lengthen across the ruins and the river darkens nearby, some sense that not all voices here have been translated, and that certain messages, once spoken, may still be waiting patiently to be understood. Stanley Palace. Tucked along one of Chester's oldest streets, Stanley Palace carries itself with quiet dignity. Its brick facade and tall windows suggest stability and refinement, the kind associated with authority and long-standing influence. By day, it appears orderly, even reassuring. Yet within its walls, history has left behind a far more unsettled inheritance. The palace dates to the late 16th century and is closely associated with the Stanley family, one of the most powerful dynasties in the region. Among them was James Stanley, the 7th Earl of Derby, a committed royalist during the English Civil War. His loyalty ultimately cost him his life, and his execution marked a violent end to a deeply divided era. It is this unresolved tension that many believe still lingers within the building. One of the most frequently reported figures is described as a negative apparition, a man with a darkened face and clothing as though light itself avoids him. He is often seen briefly without movement or sound, leaving witnesses unsure of what they have just encountered. Some connect this figure to James Stanley, though no claim can be confirmed. Other presences are said to occupy the upper floors. A grey lady has been reported in the gallery, and Queen Anne room occasionally linked to the sound of piano music drifting through otherwise empty spaces. The melody, when heard, is calm and distant, stopping as suddenly as it begins. Adding to the unease are accounts of children's voices. Laughter, singing, and the sound of running feet have been reported moving from room to room, echoing along corridors where no children are present. The effect is often described as disorientating rather than frightening, as though time itself has briefly folded. A former staff member, recalling an evening in the late 20th century, described standing alone when the sound of footsteps passed behind him, followed by quiet laughter fading into silence. He chose not to investigate, noting only a strong sense of intrusion. Today, Stanley Palace is recognized as an important historic building, its past carefully preserved. Yet as the final visitors leave and the rooms fall silent, some sense that the palace remains occupied by older loyalties, unfinished stories, and echoes that have not yet learned how to fade. Cheshire leaves its stories unfinished. If you enjoy this quiet descent into the past, consider subscribing to Creepy Experience and share which place stayed with you longest and what you felt as it faded from view.